At 7, try a taster of a brand new show about food, The Good Food Show, with food facts and top tips. Then at 7:15, we're early to Albert Square, where the coach is talking tough.
It's not a matter of life and death. Football's more important than that.
At 7:45, it's downhill all the way for a new arrival.
Yeah, everything's changing.
He's Mountie Benton Fraser, and he's headed due south. Then at 9:30, part 2 of What Did You Do in the War, Auntie, and the birth of the war correspondent.
Hello, BBC. This is Godfrey Talbot.
That's the story for Tuesday on BBC One.
Well, back to today on BBC One, and in 35 minutes, Sue Lawley will present the news from May the 8th, 1945. Now on BBC One, today's early evening news with Martin Lewis. It's 6:05.
The VE celebrations reach their climax across Europe. In London, the Queen Mother and her daughters appear on the palace balcony, just as they did 50 years ago. 250,000 people gather in the Mall as the music and the memories come flooding back.
When the world is free.
And as France remembers too, the country's new president takes his place alongside the man he succeeds. Good afternoon. Half a century after the Second World War, victory in Europe, 250,000 people have gathered to watch the Queen Mother, the Queen and Princess Margaret appear on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, joining in the singing and the celebrations just as they did all those years ago. Outside the capital, the day of celebration has been marked in villages, towns and cities across the country. Tonight, when the sun goes down, there'll be a nationwide 2-minute silence in memory of the millions who lost their lives in pursuit of victory.
It was the moment that encapsulated the mood of these 3 days of commemoration. The Queen Mother, now almost 95, on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, a poignant link between past and present. Below her, a mass of humanity, stretching almost as far as the eye could see, and the palace forecourt transformed for a day into an open-air stage.
There'll be bluebirds over the white cliffs of Dover. Tomorrow.
The sights and sounds, all so reminiscent of that day 50 years ago, seemed understandably to move her greatly. The vast crowds had converged on the palace, just as they did on VE Day itself, to pay tribute to the woman who, as Queen, had commanded the admiration of a country at war by refusing to leave London, even when the palace was bombed. Half a century ago, those same scenes were the focal point of the nation's celebrations. For days it had been clear that the war in Europe was all but over. Now, though, it was official. Time and again the King and Queen were summoned, and time and again they responded to the entreaties of the crowds. Today, many of those gathered outside the palace were reliving their experiences of 50 years ago.
It was just out of this world, the fact that you was all felt free again, you know, that you never had any more worries.
Walked home very late at night feeling as if this could go on forever, you know, you felt so wonderful.
Today it seemed that London was once again the scene of the biggest street party in the world. At times it all seemed a little overwhelming. Then daylight fireworks almost shrouded the palace in smoke and caused mild alarm on the balcony. It was an extravaganza that no one will forget as these commemorations approach their climax. Jenny Bond, BBC News.
And Jenny Bond joins me now from Hyde Park. Jenny, how is this great weekend of celebration going to end?
Well, it's going to end in a great climax here at Hyde Park. There have been huge crowds here ever since the Buckingham Palace service. I think all of them came down here, and the crowds were so big at one point that they actually had to close the gates. They've been enjoying tea dances, a workers' playtime concert. We've had the Red Devils over here parachuting down. It's all been terrific. And the big problem that the organisers have now is to try to get everyone out. They keep on appealing to everyone to leave so that they can set up for tonight, which is for ticket holders only.
And considering the crowds, there have been no problems with security at all.
No, this is the only little hiccup in trying to get people out for this grand finale tonight, when there'll be another great concert here with Vera Lynn again and the Tiller Girls. But of course the most symbolic moment, perhaps of all 3 days, will be at 8:38, when there's 2 minutes silence, and then the Queen will light the first of a chain of beacons across the country.
Jenny, thanks very much indeed. VE Day has been marked by many other events throughout the country. Thousands of people have been taking part in street parties and parades, and tonight a chain of more than 1,000 beacons will light the skies across Britain.
It was a day to party, and the nation responded in style, with celebrations enjoyed by millions of people. Huge crowds gathered on the Hoe at Plymouth to see the QE2 arrive as part of its VE Day cruise. It was here that thousands of troops embarked for the war in Europe. Today, the children had their own impressions of the importance of the occasion.
It's 50 years ago, beating the Germans and just being free. It's good that we're having VE Day on the Hill, because all the old people that are, won't be alive in 50 years' time.
There was a special tribute for veterans in Scotland who were introduced to the Princess Royal and her husband at a reception following a VE Day church service. On days like this, there's never anything to better the traditional street party. And throughout the country, young and old took advantage of the fine weather to tackle the obligatory jelly and cakes, specially tailored for the occasion. A peal of bells at York Minster, first heard 50 years ago when hostilities ended, was used again today as a mark of respect for those who gave their lives. Wartime memories were rekindled in Dorset when armoured vehicles from a local tank museum paraded along the beach. It was a temporary invasion which for once was welcomed by all. Paul Newman, BBC News.
In Berlin, representatives from the 4 wartime Allied powers, Britain, France, America and Russia, have been attending Germany's official commemoration marking the end of the war. Germany's President, Roman Herzog, who was hosting the politically sensitive ceremony, said Germany knew very well that it was responsible for unleashing the most terrible war. But he stressed that his country was now a peace-loving, democratic nation.
The leaders have a lot to celebrate, meeting in the Berlin that was Hitler's city, a Cold War city, and now the capital of a peaceful Germany. The first plan had been for Germans to mark this event on their own, but France's outgoing president, François Mitterrand, suggested widening it as a sign of friendship. All 4 post-war occupying powers, including Russia, are represented. For Germany, the federal president, Roman Herzog, made this reckoning with the past. The Germans know today, perhaps more clearly than ever, that their people were responsible for the Holocaust, even though they've not forgotten their own suffering. It's a hope, but there's no guarantee this show of togetherness can ease the conflicts and tensions arising out of the past. The Polish government, excluded from this gathering, is warning of new barriers going up in Europe. And in Germany, a fierce debate is underway over whether it's possible now to bury the sins of the past. For Berlin, as for all Germany, the end of the war was 0 hour. In the eastern sector, the Soviet military ruled with a heavy hand to contain German power. Today, there's talk of how Germany was wronged. And in Berlin this morning, politicians gathered to remember fallen Germans not as aggressors, but in the new mood of the times, as victims of the war and its aftermath. Those who lived through 0 hour spoke of the revenge against Germans in the old eastern provinces and the paradox of this anniversary.
For millions, it was the day of freedom, of liberty, of liberation. And for millions who were driven out from their homes, this was a day of catastrophe.
The far-right fringe has left its calling card on these commemorations. At the weekend, they vandalized the graves of German resistance fighters against Hitler. In the German capital, the churches today are full of those voicing their thanks that the dark wartime past is fading into history. Yet the shadow will remain as long as Germany is true to its own conscience. William Horsley, BBC News, Berlin.
Earlier, more than 80 heads of state attended a VE Day parade around the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. The outgoing French president, François Mitterrand, was joined by the new president-elect Jacques Chirac for the ceremony, which was attended by about 10,000 World War II veterans.
In Paris, it was a time of commemoration, marking not victory, but the end of fighting in Europe in 1945. But it was a day, too, that marked the changing of the political guard in France, with power passing from François Mitterrand to the new president Jacques Chirac, who sat beside him at the ceremony. Behind the military pageantry, many of the 80 world leaders in Paris, particularly those from Europe, were paying tribute to François Mitterrand and assessing the man who will succeed him as president.
Well, I've enjoyed working with President Mitterrand. We've occasionally had our differences. They've always been dealt with great charm. But I think there are many ways in which Jacques Chirac and I will see Europe in the same way, and I very much look forward to working with him.
Jacques Chirac's supporters greeted his presidential victory with a party that went on almost until dawn in the streets of Paris. But the joy may be short-lived. He made many promises to win this election and even hinted at the possibility of a referendum on the French future in Europe. His advisers know that the enthusiasm which greeted his win may not last long into his presidency. The first day of the Chirac era is a time for looking forward in France, but in this country where wartime memories of occupation and collaboration still cast long shadows, VE Day remains a time too for reflecting on the past. François Mitterrand's long career summed up many of those contradictions. The hero of the wartime resistance movement, who had also worked for the Vichy regime, which collaborated with Nazi Germany. The truth about his war record only emerged as he was preparing to leave the world stage, and may have much more influence than his 14 years as president on how he will be remembered by history. Kevin Connolly, BBC News, Paris.